Now we've talked a lot about R and how R works and clustering and how we're going to utilize this one particular statistical analysis. Now we're going to talk about, okay, how does that integrate with Tableau? So one of the wonderful things about R is that, as we mentioned before, it does a spectacular job at statistical analysis. Now, some of the things that are not so great about R. The visualization packages are not all that great. They're not bad, particularly when we talk about ggplot. It has a decent amount of capability, but none of them are anywhere near the scale and sophistication and refinement that we find in Tableau. So what we're doing here is we're going to integrate the output of R from the clustering, and we're going to push that up into Tableau so that we can do the clustering right into the Tableau visualization views. So with this integration, R functions and models can be invoked through Tableau, and we do that using what's called the calculated field. So in Tableau, we can create our own field. We can put whatever we want in that field. And typically this is associated with a formula. We might put a formula in this calculated field. But in our case, we're actually going to put some integration commands into the calculated field so that Tableau, when it executes, will go out, execute the functions in R, and then bring the results back into Tableau. Those results, when they're returned back to Tableau, are used by the Tableau visualization engine. And then you can see an example of k-means clustering visualization on the right-hand side there that was produced using R in Tableau. And if you want, you could compare that to the, I guess you call it more native ggplot example that we used a few slides ago that was produced using a native visualization package for R. And I think you'll probably conclude as we have that the Tableau visualization is much more elegant, easier to read, and provides quite a bit more sort of cognitive engagement for the user. Now, engaging R. Connections to R from Tableau are made possible using what's called rserve. So to initiate rserve, we need to type the following code on the R window. So we install a package called rserve. So that basically will create this rserve package on your machine within the R library. When we say library rserve, that loads the library into R for you. And then if we engage the function rserve in parentheses, and that could be, we might put a number of different data sets or factors in rserve there. But when we run rserve, basically that's engaging the R package to be used. So please note as you're working through your assignment that you have to open R and you have to leave it open after you initiate this rserve command. So it's kind of like, hey, I got to open R. I got to open up this communication library called rserve. And once that connection is open, then Tableau can use these functions and call using rserve and share data back and forth with the R package. So now we're going to connect Tableau to R. To connect Tableau to the R server, we're going to open Tableau Desktop, and then we're going to follow the path Settings and Performance, and then manage the R connection. From there, once we've selected the Manage R connection out of the Help menu, we're going to enter a server name. So that server name might be localhost, or it might be a particular IP address. You're just engaging sort of your own R server on your own laptop. Often you'll need a port, so you may want to define a port as well to go with that server name. And then you click on the Test Connection button to make sure everything in the communication protocol is working successfully. If you get a successful message, you'll click on OK to close. And then we're going to build in our R functions. So the base functions that are from R that we can build into Tableau are script real, that returns a real number, so it brings back real numbers. We can return a string, return an integer, or return Boolean logic. So the arguments you pass into each of these functions include our language scripts and function calls. And we can pass one or more arguments to R. So we don't just have to pass one at a time. We can pass a whole host of arguments all at the same time. So some of the defining parameters in Tableau are parameters or dynamic values that can replace constant values in calculations, filters, and reference lines. So we might go to the drop-down arrow on the upper right-hand corner of dimensions and say select create parameter. Then we'll specify the parameter name, date type, and the allowable values to be used. So generally we leave it at all unless we want to use values from a list of values, in which case we'll select list. Then we need to create our calculated field. So as I mentioned before, our calculated field is where we put that special formula or the special function calls that we want to integrate with R. So we will create a calculated field in Tableau by defining a formula based on existing fields. So in another context, we might want to just create a calculated field that says, hey, give me the month from the order date. So that's a fairly simple and straightforward response where we want to do a little bit of a data manipulation there from what we are using as a data set to what we see displayed. In our case, we're going to put a series of arguments in, and in order to create this calculated field, we'll click on Dimensions, select Create Calculated Field. The calculation editor will open, and then we can click the drop down to the right. So if you see on Dimensions, the bottom left-hand corner, the image there, and you click on that little drop down arrow, and that's where you'll find Created Calculated Field. Now, once we open up our calculated field, within where we would write a formula is where this series of arguments is going to be placed. So you'll see that we have, in this case, we're scripting integer. So that's one of the main functions we had discussed that it's available. So one of the things we're going to do is set the seed. So that's the center of each cluster. And then for, each student, we're going to define our variables. So we've got different variables, perhaps age, education, etc. If you'll recall, in R, we discuss these as vectors. At the end, we have the clusters being created. So k-means the data and the number of clusters that we want to see. So we define the set of arguments. Now, it's often that we will need to standardize variables. We may have different variables or vectors that have very different ranges of values. So I might have one that's sort of 0 to 25,000, and then I might have one that's different variable that's 0 to 0.009. So those are the scale of those numerical values are quite different. So we might need to standardize or normalize those different data variables. We'll then specify the number of clusters. So we discussed at some length the two different mechanisms or metrics where we could choose the number of clusters. Here we will simply define what the number of clusters we want to use is. And then the last function here, we're invoking the k-means statistical algorithm to run. Now, once it runs, it will visualize that set of clusters. So in this case, we're visualizing our argument might have been 6 clusters. And so in the different columns in this visual view, we'll see on the x-axis, we have cluster 1, cluster 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then each one of those clusters is divided up into survived and not survived. And this is a little bit with the tip of the hat to the data set that you guys are going to be looking at to try and determine what variables were involved with the survivors of the Titanic shipping or offshore disaster. And we see those vectors or variables represented on the left-hand side there. We have gender, age, passenger class 1, 2, or 3, the point of embarkment, which means the ship from, if you will, the place that the passenger got on the boat, and lastly, the number of siblings that the passenger had. So we're trying to figure out if they had brothers and sisters, if they were children. So in defining clusters in Tableau, the field cluster must be set to discrete. So this is something you want to make sure that you accomplish. So in the pill at the top of the screen, in the field named columns in that window or tray, you'll see a pill. And so it's a blue pill called cluster. And there's another one in there, pill called survived. So in the cluster pill, we would drop down, we'd use the little arrow down, drop down, and then we would set it to discrete as opposed to continuous. In this case, our individuals are discrete. We don't have continuous individuals. And also, the other variable within column survived must be defined as a dimension. So you want to make sure that that's showing up as a dimension. Now here we're highlighting gender by cluster, so we can go through here. We can see the different proportion of, say for example, cluster 2 comprised of male passengers, cluster 4 and 6 comprised mostly of female passengers. So just as an example of how we might read some of our box plot notation here. The departure city. So we can see 3 different colors of departure city represented by position 0, 1, and 2. Cluster 4 and cluster 6 has passengers who only boarded from Cherbourg. As you're filling up a particular ship, it might matter whether you got on at the first stop and got some of the best seats, or got on at the last stop and maybe got some of the worst seats. Then we might look at number of siblings. That gives us some insight. Was it helpful to have siblings in terms of finding out survivors or non-survivors? Which is kind of the whole ball game of this data analysis. We're trying to figure out, our main question, research question here is, what are the variables involved for those that survived versus did not survive? And so here, in an alternative way, we've represented our females and males. So we see that difference in gender with color we've highlighted. And then we again have the same structure and setup of survived and not survived within each cluster, represented on the x-axis there. We've also drawn a mean line across each one of the clusters, across the bars, for us to get a sense of, well, where would the average survival rate be? And then if we proceed to start reading through and analyzing what we have here, so we might note that cluster 2 has the highest number of non-survivors. So we can see that huge orange bar labeled with not survived. And from our color encoding, we can tell that they were all male passengers because it's in orange. We might also look at cluster 5. Has the highest number of survivors. So we might deem that, hey, cluster 5, that's a good cluster. That's a cluster you want to be in. So what do we know about the individuals that were in cluster 5? So one of the things we can tell from this visualization is they have an almost equal representation of male and female passengers. So, we might want to explore a little further. What's going on with, the representative variables in cluster 5? What's the makeup of cluster 5? Because it looks like if you were on the Titanic, you'd certainly want to have the variable values that are associated with cluster 5 when you compare it to the variables in cluster 2. And as I mentioned before, having the average reference lines helps us to quickly determine, well, are they high or average or low? We could do the same sort of thing to determine, do we have a higher or lower number of survived or not survived passengers in that particular cluster. Now, a few things about working in Tableau. Once we start getting some of our analysis views going, it's always a good idea to sort. And I want to strongly impress upon you guys, this is one of the most powerful visualization techniques that we have. So what we're looking at here is a series of revenue or sales estimates or actuals for different categories and subcategories of products. And it's fairly nice, very clean lines we see there, and we love that. And we have some dual encoding going on with color. But one of the things that we can't see that all of us want to see, the first thing that any of us does when we come to a visualization like this is somewhere, either in the back or possibly even the forefront of our mind, we ask the question, Okay, who was first? Who was last? What was the most? What was the last? And this is quite natural in the human experience. And so what we want to do for our audience through the capability of sorting is swiftly answer that question at a glance. So what we might do is perform what's called discrete sorting. So what discrete sorting is if I want to sort within my data value. So in this case, I go up to the pill for subcategory and I'm going to select sort. What that's going to do is only sort the bars within category. So I can see what are the highest, what are the lowest subcategories within each category. So once I've selected sort from the pill, I have all kinds of different approaches that I can sort with. Obviously, I can sort ascending and descending, but I can also sort on the data source order, alphabetic, or I can sort on a particular field. And notice that when I select sort on a field, there are a whole list of fields that come up that we could sort by. And so we can choose what it is that we want to sort on. So there's a lot of flexibility here in the sorting. So as an example, where we've sorted a subcategory within a category, here we've done that, and you can see in the first category of furniture, chairs and bookcases are the highest selling. If we look into the subcategory office supplies, we have storage and applications lead the group there, and then the subcategories of phones leads, I guess that's phones, along with copiers, leads the subcategories in technology, in the category of technology. We might also decide on a different approach where we want to reprioritize the sort. In this case, just through simple moving of the pill where we prioritize the subcategory before the category, we've now, instead of sorting within the category, we're sorting all the subcategories in comparison to each other. And we're basically just capturing or labeling what the category is for each. Now we may get deep into sorting and we may decide, no, I don't want to do that anymore. So very simply, we can go back up, drop down on the sorting icon and clear the sorts, and it will clear all the sorts that you've just applied. And now let's talk a little bit about grouping. So, clustering is a very sophisticated algorithmic mechanism for grouping, but it's certainly not the only approach to grouping. So we could visually sort, say for example, in equal steps. So all my measurements between 0 and 100 is a group. All my measurements between 100 and 200 is a group. 200 and 300 is a group. We might group in unequal steps. So we might have a formula. We take first and last multiplied by the count. We get double of addition, for example. So here our first and last was, our first data value was 2, our last was 14. We multiplied it by 5 data values, and that gives us 80. So we might do unequal steps from 40 to 80. Or irregular steps. So an example of an irregular step might just be quartiles of a distribution. Just give me the 0 to 25 percentile, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, and 75 to 100. And I encourage you guys to read up in Isabel's Design for Information text that we provided in the syllabus to have an alternative explanation of the same information. So when we go into Tableau and we define groups for a measure, we can perform a drop-down, select Create Group, and once we've done that, we can create any kind of meaningful group. And this is very, very flexible. You'll notice that we can provide sort of a directed approach, as we were talking about, 0 to 100, for example, or if we preferred, we could simply manually go in, provide a label for a group, and then just assign different values for it, if that was our preference or what we wanted to accomplish. Now, summarizing our conversation from today, the knowledge generation model engages the creativity of humans with the high processing capacity of machine learning. So we're marrying up that sort of intuition of human beings with the pure processing power of machine learning. The exploration loop of the knowledge generation model helps to identify interesting patterns. We're discovering. We're trying to figure out, hey, what's there? What looks interesting? What's unusual? What doesn't seem to fit our expectations? Then we proceed to the verification loop. Well, we found some things that look interesting, but we want to verify that what we think we see is what we see. So we're trying to identify insights and then verify the hypothesis related to those insights. Then finally, we get to the knowledge generation loop, which is a building process where we take previous knowledge, we exercise some judgment over our verification of insights and hypothesis, and we make decisions on whether we've increased or improved our knowledge and our understanding about that knowledge. Our Tableau R integration is a way that we can do integrated analysis. It's a way we can sort of marry up two very strong methods for analysis so that we have a visually enriching platform to analyze results from that statistical analysis that happens in a R or other statistical software package. This concludes the lecture on integrated analysis.